Good evening, everybody. You're extremely welcome to the Chester Beatty this evening. A very warm welcome. It's really lovely to see so many colleagues and friends joining us this evening. I'm Fionnuala Croke, Director of the Chester Beatty, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our 2025 annual lecture. Every year we celebrate Sir Alfred Chester Beatty's birthday with an annual lecture as a way of honouring his legacy in sharing his remarkable collections with the Irish nation and visitors and scholars from all around the world. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to invite our online audience to please put your questions and comments into the Q&A function. Just note that the chat function is disabled. And please also, if you could just keep your questions short and focused. I suspect we're going to have a lot of questions and we won't have time for them all, but we will do our very best. Also, if you wish, you could enable closed captions, which will give you subtitles on the screen. But we have here, and you can see online, we have an Irish Sign Language interpreter with us this evening, Shelley Gibson. And so to this evening's talk and our special guest. And I suspect that Edmund de Waal requires little or no introduction with our audience this evening. Edmund is an artist, potter, and author, known for his large-scale installations of porcelain vessels, often created in response to collections and archives or to the history of a particular place. Edmund has published extensively, but perhaps is best known for the best-selling book The Hare with the Amber Eyes, which has won numerous international awards. His second book, The White Road, traces his journey to discover the history of porcelain and was released in 2015. He's also collaborated, and we had a really lovely chat about this afternoon, he's collaborated with numerous museums around the world. The Kunsthistorische Vienna, the Rijksmuseum, V&A, British Museum, Frick Collection, and many other museums around the world. And this evening, Edmund will be speaking about his unexpected inheritance of 264 Japanese Netsuke from his great-great-uncle, Charles Efrusi. And he'll be talking about how this has led him to explore ideas around exile and migration in both his writing and his artistic practice. Now, Charles Efrusi acquired the Netsuke collection during the height of the craze for Japonism in Paris in the 1870s. Some 30 or 40 years later, the appeal of Japanese objects and Japanese style was still strong, and we find Chester Beatty, also a man of private means and refined aesthetic sensibilities, following a similar path of collecting Japanese lacquerware, sword guards, inro, and, of course, Netsuke. A small select group of our Netsuke is on view upstairs in the museum in the In Focus exhibition Zodiac Netsuke. I only wish we had detailed records for all of Chester's purchases. That research is a work in progress, and great progress is being made. And I wish indeed we had more direct insights into what drove Chester, what really motivated him as a collector. Edmund has really managed to do that in such a great way for Charles Efrusi's collection of Netsuke, and he's gone further, exploring the relationship between objects and memory, demonstrating how these diminutive items can carry and transmit memory across generations. So enough from me. Please now welcome Edmund de Waal to the podium to speak on Good for a Single Journey, Netsuke and Stories in a Fractured World.
Thank you so very much, and what an honour to be here with you tonight, in person and online, and what an honour to be near such extraordinary treasures of the Chester Beatty collection. It's a unique collection, and it's one that I'm in awe of, and I honour tonight. I can't tell you the numbers of hours I've spent in this building over the decades. So thank you for having me here. Bear with me. I'm going to start by talking about these. When I was 17, I ran away from school to Japan to be a potter. And after a very hot, long summer of sitting at the feet of quite gruff and bad-tempered Japanese potters, with very long hair and in very raggedy clothes, I found myself in Tokyo, ringing the doorbell of my great uncle Ignace von Ephrussi. He was 80 years old, beautifully dressed. He had a bow tie and a pocket handkerchief in his top pocket, a very beautifully trimmed moustache. He opened the door, an elderly Viennese aristocrat living in 1980s Tokyo. He opened the door, there was jazz playing. He gave me a whiskey sour. I was 17. And one whole wall of his beautiful apartment was a vitrine that was full of small Japanese objects. There's a story here, he said, and we became friends. A very, very long time later, I inherited this collection. And I had this collection of objects in my house, in a vitrine, and my children were growing up, and my father was getting older. And I realized that they had brought with them, they held with them an imperative. They held a challenge to me. Was I going to spend my life just living with these objects and thinking of them as a benign, anecdotal way of threading a story? Or was I going to find out where they had been, what they had seen, whose hands they'd been in, what they carried, and what was left behind? And I persuaded my wife that I would take 6 months and write a story and do the research, and 7 years later, I published a book. It's a story that begins here in Paris. It begins in the Rue de Monceau, in a beautiful hill of mid-19th century houses built of beautiful golden stone. It's the quarter of Paris that was constructed on the edge of the Parc Monceau for all those assimilated Jewish families that are arriving from the Levant, from all over Europe, and making Paris, that great new cosmopolitan city, their home. And my family, the Ephrussi family, who had shamefully cornered the market in grain in Odessa, had become plutocratically, oligarchically rich, had sent their children like good Rothschilds round Europe to marry good Jewish girls and become even richer. And part of the family ended up here in Paris, and half of them in Vienna. And there were 3 boys, and the first does the right thing and marries the right Jewish girl. The second is, quotes, a lover of women, I discover of in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is why I have so many French cousins. And the third son, Charles Ephrussi, is rich and young and educated and has an eye for art and an empty house. And so in 1867, when they move into this beautiful house, he starts to buy art. And the first thing he buys are Medici embroideries. And he unpicks the M for Medici and puts E for Ephrussi into his bed. This is the bed of a 20-year-old young man in Paris. And he buys a famous carpet of the golden winds from Gobelin and cuts it down to size for his salon. And he becomes someone of great taste. He becomes someone who knows how to look at art. He grew up partly in Vienna, looking at Dürer, and he becomes a scholar. He starts to write for the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, and then becomes the editor, and then he buys it. This is the story of my family. And here he is at the back of his friend Renoir's painting, in the top hat amongst all his friends, because he is the friend of artists. He buys this beautiful young picture off the easel of his friend Renoir. He buys this, which, damn it, is in Chicago. He buys this from Monet, which, damn it, is in the National Gallery. He buys beautiful, extraordinary impressionist art, one picture after another. This is in the Met. He befriends Berthe Morisot and writes the first extraordinary critique of Morisot's work about how she can inhabit the domestic life amongst all these men in the Impressionist movement. He buys her work. He amplifies her work out into the world. And one day he sees this on an easel of his friend Manet. And because he's generous to a T, Charles Froussy asks the price. It's 800 francs. He gives him 1,000. And then a week later, to 81 Rue de Monceau, this is delivered with a note which says, "This one has slipped from the bundle, my friend." And if you know this story, you know it because it turns up in Proust, because at this point, Charles Froussy's young friend, who is helping him catalogue his exhibitions and sort out his correspondence, is the young Marcel Proust. And Charles Froussy seeds into Charles Swann. So try imagining, this is, having told my wife it's 6 months' work, here I am stuck in the archives of Paris and the years are ticking by. Because this extraordinary man, Charles Froussy, acquires 264 Netsuke, 264 of these extraordinary objects, because all of these friends, all of this milieu that he's living in, everyone is collecting Japanese art. Everyone wants to be ahead of themselves. It's a competitive world of buying Japanese art. And he buys them because they are the perfect things for a salon. He has them in a vitrine with all those impressionist paintings on the top floor of the Rue de Monceau, because you open up your vitrine and you hand them round. Can I pass these round to you? These are two of the Netsuke from the collection, mid-18th century from Charles Froussy's collection. Yes, please. I wouldn't mind them back at the end of the evening. And this is how they work. This is how these objects work. But he gets grander. He moves to a bigger house with his brother. He starts collecting Empire furniture. He falls in love with Gustave Moreau. His taste changes. And as he approaches his 60s, here, this beautiful, delicate portrait of him, these objects of fascination, these objects of desire, become less important to him. And so in 1899, he does an extraordinary thing, because in 1899, my great-grandfather Victor in Vienna, the Viennese side of the family, is getting married. And so in 1899, 264 Netsuke and a vitrine as tall as a tall man, in the memory of my great-uncle, moved from Paris to this immodest family house in Vienna, because it's all very well living in the Rue de Monceau, but if you're going to be Jewish bankers in Vienna, you build yourself this house. This is the Palais of Froussy. This is my father's house. And it is an impossible building. You come in, and there is the E for a Froussy. You go up into the salons, into the dining rooms, into the ballroom. And then there is a moment on this extraordinary gold and marble palace on the Ringstrasse, this street of assimilated Jewish families from all around Europe who have made Vienna their home in this great cosmopolitan Austro-Hungarian Habsburg melting pot of civilization, every language, the best universities, the most extraordinary law courts, the great Kunsthistorische Museum being built, this great place to move to and become Austro-Hungarian. This is the place that you want to be. And my family build this house, and there's one room in this house where Gentile families are allowed to come for parties. That's the ballroom. And when you go up the great staircase to the ballroom and you look up, you see that my great-great-grandfather who built this astonishing house has painted the scenes of the destruction of the enemies of Zion and the coronation of Queen Esther on the ceilings of this great ballroom. They are the only Jewish scenes in the whole of 19th century Vienna. This is their family house. And this is where Victor, my great-grandfather, scholarly and rather rabbinical, who wants to become a scholar of the Talmud, has to get married in a hurry. He has to get married in a hurry because his elder brother Stefan, and I promise you I won't go over the hour, I promise you this. His elder brother Stefan has eloped with their father's mistress. You have to take a pause here. Freud lives across the street in Berggasse and treats most of the family. So Victor has to become a banker in a hurry and have heirs, and so he marries the Baroness from the Palais next door, my great-grandmother Emmy, who is beautiful and young and loves dressing up. This is her in characteristic modest attire. And she is remarkable and intelligent and young, and she has lovers. This is her with one of her lovers, one of the archdukes, beautifully dressed in the street in Vienna. And she has children. She has my grandmother and my great-aunt Gisela here in this beautiful picture. And in her dressing room in the Palais of Russie, in the corner of the Schottentor and the Ringstrasse, there is that vitrine. And every evening as she dresses to go out for another engagement, the children come into this room. They're allowed to open the vitrine. They're allowed to play with these Netsuke. You think of them in Paris amongst all those writers and painters, but here they accrete a different kind of storytelling. They're in the hands of children. They become playthings, and they are beautiful and funny and erotic and scary. Look at the tigers in the collection. Look at the dragons. Look at the demons. Look at all those incredible things that can happen in your hands as you hold an object and begin to tell a story. And this is where the three children, my grandmother, her younger sister, and my great-uncle Iggy, play and see their mother. And this is their house. And this is how they grow up. My grandmother, so bright, intellectual, a poet. She writes to Rilke. Rilke writes back. There is a great correspondence, which I'm publishing next year, these great letters between Rilke, the great poet, and this young, dynamic young woman writing to her, asking for advice. And because they are so assimilated and cultured, this is what they do day in, day out. This is our book of shame for any parent. This is how you should bring up your children properly. This is their opera and theatre book. And it shows you that they go to Lessing, and then Shakespeare, and then Schiller, and then Goethe, and then Wagner, all within a month. This is how you should bring up your children. Shame on you. This is what it's like to be in Vienna. And this is how the family grow up in that ridiculous palace. And you know what happens next. Because there is Iggy in 1926, who doesn't want to become another dynastic Jewish banker. He is gay, he hates numbers, and he runs away. Running away is very important in this story. He runs away to New York to become a fashion designer. In his words, the worst fashion designer on the East Coast of America. And he might have been right. But there he is. living his life in New York. And my grandmother, scholarly, a lawyer, marries my grandfather, and she escapes to Paris to live there. And Gisela marries a good Jewish boy and goes to Mexico. And then in 1938, this happens. The Anschluss. That moment of complete and utter terror, that turning inside out of Austria. The night of the Anschluss, the doorman of the Palais Efrissi, who had been there for 45 years, leaves the gates unlocked. The door of their apartment on that first floor is broken down. My great-grandmother, Emmy, is beaten up and robbed. My great-grandfather, Victor, is forced into the street outside the house. Like so many, he is forced onto his knees. He is 84 years old to scrub the streets. And systematically over the next week, the house is looted, first by neighbours and then by art historians and functionaries. The director of the Kunsthistorische Museum comes 3 days after the Anschluss to decide which pictures should be taken to Berlin, which pictures are for the museums, which artworks are to be kept and which disposed of. And very gradually, this dispossession, this stripping away first of objects and then of rights, first of personal space and then of public space, so that you cannot sit on a bench on the Ringstrasse, you cannot go to the cafe, you have no job. And then your bank is taken, your house is taken, and your children are threatened with Dachau and taken and then redeemed and then brought back. And my grandmother Elizabeth, with enormous courage, as an academic, she was in risk of imprisonment, goes back to Vienna in May 1938, and she gets her mother and her father across the border to their family house in Slovakia, which is where Emmy, that beautiful, society, intelligent mother, commits suicide, not believing that she will escape. And this is my great-grandfather Victor's passport, which shows that eventually he got the stamps good for a single journey to come to England in 1939, at the same time as my father and my grandmother and my grandfather. In the records in Vienna, I find pages torn out of notebooks. I find redactions. I find missing files in the museums. And then in the records of the Jewish Museum, the Jewish community, I find that every single person of Jewish heritage living in Vienna in 1938 has their name crossed out. Men are now to be called Israel, and women are to be called Sarah. And this is where my great-grandfather, Victor von Efrissi, born in Odessa, a Viennese citizen, stateless, lives the last few years of his life in England, in Tunbridge Wells, in a suburban street, during the war with my father and my grandmother. And as a scholarly man, he sits by the grate in the kitchen of this house, and he quotes Virgil to my father about the destruction of the city of Troy, lacrimae rerum, the tears of things. And after the war, after he's died in 1945, Iggy, who had joined the American army, fought on D-Day, and I find this unbelievably moving. This is his Jeep on D-Day, and he's called his Jeep Elizabeth, for his sister arrives in England. And my grandmother Elizabeth has gone back to Vienna to see what is left. What is left after the war in Vienna, with all those displaced people, those empty streets, no single Jewish person left. In Austria, the house is in ruins. It's occupied by the American army. There's nothing left apart from furniture that, according to my grandmother, who was wry, furniture that was too ugly even for the Gestapo to loot. And there, in that house, with nothing there, she meets her mother's maid, Anna. And Anna, during the Anschluss, during the looting of the family house, the stripping away of all the grand things the family had taken every single one of these Japanese Netsuke the children had played with, this family collection, and hidden it. And she gives it back to my grandmother. And Elizabeth comes back to England with an attaché case full of small Japanese objects. She comes back with an attaché case full of stories. And Iggy, this lovely, funny, intelligent, questioning man, deracinated man, arrives in the family house and sees them there, and he does not know what to do with his life. But seeing these Netsuke, he says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to take them home. Unbelievably, in 1947, he goes to Tokyo, to another destroyed city. Here he is, so good looking, so well dressed, so amused by my shabby clothes when I arrive that he takes me to his tailor the next day. And in Tokyo in the late 1940s, he builds a house. And he builds a vitrine, and he puts all the family Netsuke out in a vitrine. And when he meets his beloved partner in 1951, Jiro Sugiyama, a young Japanese man, bilingual, funny, loving American cinema, and they decide that they are in love together and will live together. Here they are, the young Jiro and Iggy together. They make a larger house together and give the best parties. And they open up their vitrine of Netsuke, these two loving gay men living together, the third place for this collection of objects. And he hands them round Paris with Renoir and Proust, and then Vienna, and now, amazingly, in Tokyo. And when I bury them, when I say Kaddish for my uncle Iggy in his Buddhist grave that he and Jiro have planned together, and go back to their apartment together, and Jiro hands me an envelope which says, you have now been given the family collection. You can see why it's complicated. How do you make sense of this inheritance? How do you make sense of something which starts in Odessa on the edge of the Black Sea, here where all those cultures intermingle and start out, this place where the family who have escaped the shtetls become a family that moves from one place to another, from Odessa to Paris to Vienna to Tunbridge Wells to Tokyo. How am I supposed to deal with these funny, quixotic, complicated bundles of energy I'm given? So I'm a potter. I make things. How I make them, how I think of them, what they feel like in the hand is hugely significant for me. Objects aren't inert. They are powerful pulses of energy. They carry something with them. They carry with them all kinds of compressed and complex stories. And so when I'm invited to go back to Vienna by the Kunsthistorische to make an installation for the Theseus Temple, which sits on the Ringstrasse, their space that they use for contemporary art, what am I going to do? The book has just come out, the book that no one wanted to publish, the book that I was scared to let go into the world. So what do I take to Vienna? I make 2 vitrines and I fill them with hundreds of very small porcelain objects. And I write the poems of Paul Celan on the wall. Celan, the most extraordinary poet of the 20th century, whose family was murdered in the Shoah, who writes in German, but whose poems are powerful and compressed and broken up and painful. He writes of homecoming, of snow, of the colour white, which his mother's hair he will never see. And he writes a poem called Lichtzwang, light duress. So I make this installation called Lichtzwang, and it's there for a year in Vienna, in this pavilion, and the critics hate it, which I think is the greatest mark of respect I could have from Vienna possible. But because it's warm and in a park, it's where mothers take their kids when it's raining, and there's always a tramp there. And it's there, back in Vienna. But there is nothing settled. So really what I'm talking to you about tonight is about the unsettled nature of this. That I write a book which I hope is some kind of act of restitution in itself, some kind of way of talking not about getting objects back, not about reacquiring property, but a way of trying to restitute a family to a city or a memory to a place, trying to reconnect parts of a story that have been erased or effaced, trying to find those gaps where files have been taken and destroyed and put back into them something which is about people, which takes me back here. It takes me back to Paris, to my more recent book, which takes me back to the Rue Monceau, because I realized that I had some unfinished business in this street. Because down the hill from our family's house, 10 doors down, is this extraordinary house, the Musée Nissim de Camondo. It's very, very beautiful. It's another Parisian palais. It's an extraordinary golden house set back from the street across a gravelled courtyard. You go in winding staircases full of the most extraordinary French art of the 18th century, all put together by the Count Moïse de Camondo, a Jewish financier who'd come from Constantinople in the same year as my family, who'd built their house at the same year as their family, and had intermarried. They were cousins. This is the painting. This is Moïse de Camondo in characteristically stern expression. And this is the very beautiful picture that Charles Froussy got his lover, Louise Candavert, to commission from Renoir. This is Irène, who grew up and married the Count Camondo. And this extraordinary collector decides that he's going to put together a peerless collection of art. He loves objects. He loves books. He loves creating interiors where one object can speak to another. He buys the things that Charles Froussy had left behind and puts objects down with enormous care. And because he loves food, he builds the best kitchen in Paris. And I'd known this house because my grandmother had gone endlessly as a child and then in her 20s to visit her cousins there. This was a house where her elder cousin, this young man here sitting with her father, who'd been killed in the First World War, had a presence in a house that had really become a kind of mausoleum. Because the Count Camondo wanted this whole house to sit in remembrance of his lost son, to be a kind of pinnacle of French taste in honor and gratitude for their position in French society. It's incredibly painful. It's the most perfect house possible. This is the house where my father's cousin, this wonderful composer Léon Reynac, and his wife Béatrice Camondo bring up their children. It's a house full of furniture and art, but it's also a family house full of children. And this is the difficult bit, because the Camondo family decided that they would give the house to France in gratitude. And so in 1938, the house and all its contents become a museum, the Musée Nissim de Camondo. It's a perfect museum. It's a perfect memorial to this son who died for France. It's a perfect memorial for perfect Parisian family. And you know what happens next. You know that in 1940, that the German army walk in unopposed. You know about Vichy. You know about Pétain. You know about the systematic looting of all the Jewish families in Paris, the stripping away of one thing and then another and then another. This is our family house in 1943, filled with the possessions of other Jewish families. Members of the Gestapo families were allowed to come and choose the possessions of Jewish families who were no longer living in their addresses. Because systematically, families are rounded up and sent to Drancy on the outskirts of Paris, guarded by Parisian police. So you want to talk about archives. And I'd spent so long in the archives of the Camondo family, looking at all those beautiful menus of the family and the art collections. But when you find the cards which show each family member Anna Per Libre, 4 quarters Jewish, and the date of their arrest. And then you find that each member of the family has been deported to Auschwitz, and the name and the date of their deportation. You begin to wonder what has happened to this family. This is the young Bertrand Camando who wanted to be a furniture restorer, who grew up in the house with his grandfather's furniture. Here he is with the family dog in 1940. He's murdered in 1943. Writing about this family, my family, I'm confronted by the fact that objects and places are unsettling. When you go to the Musée Nissim Camando, you can go to an extraordinary collection of French furniture and walk around the museum and walk out again, full of the pleasures of Fragonard and Chardin and Watteau, filled up with the beauties of Sèvres, and not realize that the reason that this house is intact, the only house in France intact that belonged to a Jewish family, is because it was given to France. And as a French national monument, it was protected and is still protected. But where is the story? Where can you listen in to those objects? How can you retell that story of giving and things being taken away? It's generative. How do you make this happen in this fractured world? I'm hurrying up. We're running out of time. I'm taking you to Venice. I'm taking you to the ghetto. I'm taking you to an invitation. Everything takes forever. That's the point about my life. Books take 7 years. Projects take 10 years. You want me to do a project here? Form an orderly queue. I would love to. But Venice took a decade. The ghetto, the first ghetto, an invitation to work in this place, to make work in the synagogues. Adonai says this small piece on the way up towards the synagogue. I make work which settles into these extraordinary 5 synagogues in the ghetto. I make work. Here is a piece that I make that you can see on the edges of this amazing 17th century synagogue. I call it Tehillim, Hebrew for psalm. It is a psalm. It's a prayer. You pray it one way and you pray it another. This is the only place in Venice where there's no gold and marble allowed because it's Jewish, according to the edicts of the ghetto. So I make porcelain and gold and marble, and I bring these works into this place during the Venice Biennale. And then high up in the sukkah, I make this piece right up high. And here it is. It's a temporary structure. That's what the sukkah is. It's a place of respite and pleasure. And here up high in the sukkah, I make this place of rest, which stays there, and it's now in Jerusalem. But here it is in Venice. But then I do something else, because it's about making things that you can see, but it has to be about books. So on the other side of Venice, I decide I'm going to make a library. And I make a library in honor of my great-grandfather Victor, who saw his library in Venice, in Vienna in 1938, put onto trucks and taken onto the Ringstrasse and destroyed, left God knows where, probably still in some princely collection somewhere in Bavaria, who knows. So I make a library of exile. What is it? It's a structure where I put porcelain slip on the outside of the walls, and I write over the walls a history of the lost and destroyed libraries of the world, from Alexandria all the way through to all the libraries looted and destroyed all the burnings of books, mostly by holy men and by princes who don't want books to exist. And I write that as a threnody all the way around. And then inside, I put together a library of 2,500 books written by people who have been forced across borders, people who've been forced into exile, 78 languages, 90 countries. Each country has its own shelf, books in translation, books in the original language, and each one of them has an ex libris plate so that you can pick it up and write your own name in the book if that book matters to you. And it's a place of reading and writing and talking. It's a noisy library. It's not a quiet library. It's a place of discussion, and there's poets and poetry readings, and there's dance, and there's all kinds of activity, but mostly it's full of people looking and reading and writing their names. This is a book that mattered to me. This is the book my grandmother gave me. This is the book I want my grandchildren to understand. This is where we came from. This is our knowledge. This is what language does. It moves across borders with energy and beauty and velocity, and we welcome it. Our language and our worlds are endlessly, generatively, generously reinvigorated, revivified by people bringing their stories with them. And I make a total foolish mistake. I make a box which says, if there's a book in the library that's not there, put your name in it and I will buy your book, which means I am bankrupt. Because by the end of the tour, by the time it's gone from Venice to Dresden, to the extraordinary burnt-out Japanische Palais as its next port of call, this extraordinary building, and had its other life there at an extraordinary and devastating moment when the AFD is at an ascendancy, and we have our first guests were Syrian refugees who'd arrived in Dresden the day before, and they found a book, a children's book, and then it goes on to the British Museum, and on and on and on. It's a library of possibilities. And where does it end up? Where's this library now? ISIS destroyed the most extraordinary library in Mosul, a great cross-faith, wonderful international library, because they are scared of books. Where do we see that now in the world? And so 4,500 books with so many names, so many ex libris plates are put on a truck with Book Aid International and arrive in Mosul, where they're now part of the new Library of Mosul. And that structure is now the reading room at the new Warburg Institute in London. It's their new reading room. And what about my Netsuke? What about my wonderful, beautiful collection of these fabulous objects? With tears running down my face, I pack them and I take them back to Vienna. And I take them to Vienna and I put them on long-term loan in the Jewish Museum in Vienna. Because you have to find a place where objects tell their stories with the most power. And why do I do that? Because it's a possibility of return. Because I gift them, and then my father, now 96 years old, comes with me to Vienna, where there is an exhibition about the family, and he stands in his old family house, a place he never said he would go back to, a place that he told me, I have no memories of it, but when he's there with his two grandsons, he says, let me show you where my bedroom is. It brings him back, and here is the President of Austria greeting him on his return. I don't know how to end, but that's because you can't, except to say thank you, and I've overrun, and bless you for coming tonight.
Well, what can I say? I have to say thank you. Thank you so much, Edmund. That was compelling, that was emotional. And, you know, objects and collections are charged with stories, charged with emotions, and they travel through time, they traveled through space, if you like, from place to place. And thank you for caring so much to work with that story and bring us with you and right up to the present. And the collaborations and the projects that you're doing are really inspiring and very beautiful and really reflective. I'm sure you all feel as I do that really was a special talk, and thank you so much. Yeah, well done. And I'm just thinking, you know, that the Netsuke, those little Netsuke just remained. And thank you for passing around 2 of the Netsuke to the audience, because it's so important to feel objects. And regretfully, that's something that's so difficult in a museum, but something that Edmund was so generous to share that experience with us this evening. And, you know, these little objects, and all objects, in your story in particular, they remain this reassuring constant right through this time of shattering change, really. So questions. We'll start with questions here in the room, in the lecture theatre in the Chester Beatty, and then we'll move to take some of your questions online, which reminds me I have to grab my phone for that.
There may be no questions.
There may be no questions or comments. Thank you, this lady. Yeah.
I'd just like to know, do you know the name of the maid that hid them away and kept them?
We know that she was called Anna,
Yeah.
and I never asked my great uncle her surname, because at that moment I wasn't researching.
Yes. Yeah.
When the book came out in Vienna, there was a great headline, you know, who is Anna? The story is hugely benign about the giving back. It turns out that there may have been more complications, which I've only more recently discovered through an academics living in Vienna, that maybe it wasn't quite as straightforward a transaction in the giving back. So this is interesting, because for my grandmother and my great uncle, it was an extraordinary act of restitution, and they said no more about it. So Viennese academics, being these academics, have gone into the weeds with it and think it's more complicated. But for me, that sort of doesn't matter in the slightest. It was given back.
And she kept them safe. You know,
She kept them safe. On the issues of complicated restitution, just showing you how wretched it is, provenance stuff. There was a huge painting as big as this screen here that was recently restituted to the family, that was hanging on the walls of the Viennese, the Austrian Museum of Military History. And in the record, they'd done no provenance research. In the records, it's in 1948, they go, this belongs to the Afrussi family, but we don't know where any of them are, and it doesn't really matter. So what I've done, having inherited it back as the head of the family, is I've given it to the Jewish Museum.
We have a question in the front row.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. So it's very, very moving. I'm holding one of your Netsuke in my hand, and I see they're numbered on the back.
Yes.
Are these the originals, or are these from a different collection?
So the little tiny paper labels are from Iggy, who put them in about 1952. He made a record of all of them, and so of course I've kept the labels on. And, you know, there they all are. I mean, the lovely thing for me, of course, is that, you know, because I knew him when I was 17, but then I had a whole year with him when he was very, very elderly. I was living in Tokyo, writing a book, being a potter, and actually our evening ritual, he was a great believer in his whiskey sours, 5:30, beautiful music on the record player, and then he would pick these things up and talk about them, and out of that would come all these extraordinary sort of threshold of his life. He would then be talking about life in 1910. Astonishing moment.
Yes, we have one more question down towards the back, and then I might go online.
Thank you. I was fascinated by the whole thing of the destruction of the books, remembering reading that wonderful book by Richard Overton, The Burning of the Books, which, you know, it was so carefully done to destroy the whole memory of a culture, civilization, and a people. And it was amazing. I mean, I hadn't related it to the family, but it was amazing to see it done in that situation. Your talk was unbelievable, and I am overwhelmed with emotion from it. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I mean, the point about the unfinishedness of this is that, of course, the burning of books, the destruction of records is a deliberate act in war. People destroy libraries and records in order to cut people off from history, in order to prevent them going home to their stories. And Richard's book is remarkable. He's a remarkable man, whilst a scholar. You know, so how you hold libraries, how you hold these stories are hugely, hugely important.
I'll take an online question now, and the first one I have is long but worth getting to. Similarly to your use of the Netsuke collection's migrations, I'm using Irish Big House Library books and the circumstances of their migrations away from their home of origin to try to uncover the impact of the Irish Free State on their Anglo-Irish owners. Yet their owners appear to have left little record of their own departures. How did you fill in any gaps in the Netsuke family history? Did you maybe pivot or reframe your question or focus?
Blimey. I feel like I've suddenly become part of a supervision. So I'm very clear about when I don't know things. I'm not an academic. And so it's really important for me to think about why there are gaps in stories. People often want to create, sometimes, like the lady there, things deliberately burnt. There are systematic erasures. But sometimes, through trauma, people actually don't want to talk about things. They don't write them down, and they're silent. And a good example of this is my wonderful grandmother, Elizabeth, who in the 1970s burnt all her mother's and grandmother's correspondence. And when I was writing the book, I thought, how could she, extraordinary, that's 100 years of history and kind of amazing. Why? And I reflected on it, and I was thinking, there's privacy. There are moments when you don't want to pass things on. And at that moment, no one is talking about the Shoah. No one is talking about Holocaust. Primo Levi isn't being read in 1970. And she's protecting the next generation down. But those silences can be picked up by generations. So they aren't inert. Silences are never inert. So you can create a silence within a family's story or within a historical moment, thinking that you're helping the next generation along. But somewhere along the line, you can be sure as eggs, somewhere down the line, someone's going to say, why is there this silence? So that's a completely tangential non-answer to that interesting question.
Okay, so this one might be a little this might be easier for you. Thank you for the most thought-provoking and passionate story. I wonder, do you have any comment on the place of nature and the natural world in all of this, given your work as a potter using clay?
Well, yes. I mean, in fact, actually, one of my great sort of other parallel stories which was in another book, which was about all going back to the different hillsides where clay, porcelain clay, has been discovered. So it's absolutely going back into the places where it happened and seeing why and how that happened. And sometimes that's the destruction of particular landscapes. And also it can be very particular. You know, as you probably have gathered, I'm slightly obsessional. And so journeys take me to China, you know, to the German clay mines, but they also take me to the Appalachian Mountains to try and find out where Wedgwood had white clay dug up in the 1760s. So yes is the answer. I'm very, very aware of where things come from. Origin stories, foundational stories, where things begin. And for me, obviously, that's clay.
Okay, so lots and lots of thank yous and lovely compliments online. So
what a
which
lovely
we
audience.
would, of course, expect. So maybe just one final question from online here. What do you find special? Well, I think you've said a lot of this, but perhaps another few words. What do you find special about the Netsuke, but the ability of storytelling from these objects? I suppose, what is it in the Netsuke particularly?
So there's something interesting. I'm very glad that those who are present in a non-digital way this evening have had something in their hands, because of course if you have something in your hands, every time you hold it you are rubbing something away, but at the same time you're adding patina to something. So the odd thing about these Netsuke is that they're both adding storytelling. You just think of all the people's hands these objects have been in, so you're adding another layer, a whole kind of panoply of storytelling each time they're handled. At the same time, you know, I have Netsuke in the collection, Vienna, where there's almost nothing left. You know, I talk about one or two where there's just, you know, it's a memory of a fox. It's just, you know, just almost like a piece of wood where there's just a tail and a nose. And so, you know, that's what's interesting is that storytelling isn't linear. You know, it just isn't. I mean, well, good storytelling isn't linear. Storytelling should be surprising, and it should enact different kinds of responses. And because we are so hopeless at understanding the relationship between memories and our hands, these are wonderful, questioning, complex beginnings of storytelling. Will that do? That was quite good, actually.
Did anybody else in the room want to come in? Did anything strike you while you were listening? Yes, in the front row. We're just waiting for a mic.
Thank you. That was just wonderful. I'm like everybody else. I'm overwhelmed with emotions, and I also absolutely loved the book, so I'm looking forward now to reading more of what you've written. I wasn't so familiar with your other books. This probably sounds like a very selfish question, but I don't know whether you have children, but did you hesitate, or did they cause you to hesitate before you gave the collection? I know it's on permanent loan, but it came down through your family to you, and now it's gone out of your family. Was that something you thought a lot about?
It's very definitely on long-term loan rather than gift. But yes, I have 3 children, and you know, and they love them. They played with them as small children, and you know, there will be a moment when they're not in Vienna, and they're in different households. I hope, God willing. So yes, they will continue. They will continue in people's hands. I love museums. I absolutely love museums, and there's a place for having things not in museums too. If I can put that to the director of the Chester Beatty Museum.
We have one final, I will make just the final question, if it's, thank you, just in the room. The lady in the red jumper, yeah.
Thank you. I've just plucked up the courage to ask a rather outside question, and it's to do with the Netsuke themselves. And am I right that they were worn on a belt? And was it was the wearing of it some kind of like progress through the army? Or what?
Do you know, actually, may I recommend an extremely good exhibition at the Chester Beatty on the next floor?
I know. Yes, I've been there.
Oh, well, it's got a lovely diagram,
Yes,
actually, of it there.
I know.
So,
Yeah.
so no, nothing to do with the army.
Yeah.
Everything to do with play and pleasure.
Pleasure,
So
yes.
nothing martial at all. But yes, absolutely on a belt. Yes.
On a belt, yeah.
Yes.
But I mean, sometimes anyway, they appeared to be, play acting as in armor or in poses.
No, not quite so much. Not quite so much. No, they're more quixotic than that. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this afternoon we had a lovely session, enjoyed looking at some of the Netsuke from the Chester Beatty collection that I'm sorry to say are not on display. It was a very privileged thing to do, I know, but we just talked about the fun of the Netsuke, to be honest, and the fun of the great joy of handling them and the fun of interpreting them and the wearing of them. I'm going to leave the questions at that because I don't want to try people's patience keeping them for too long. Please join me once again to thank Edmund.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I also want to please thank my wonderful colleagues here in the Chester Beatty. You know, an evening like this takes a lot of planning, as I'm sure many of you can appreciate. And in particular, let me mention Derval O'Carroll, Gilly Clark, Justina Gelminska, Ariane Dunn, and Jason Collins. And for those of you who are with us in the museum this evening, the Zodiac Netsuke exhibition is of course open upstairs if you haven't seen it. For those who are online and may not even be in Ireland, there is a wonderful virtual exhibition of the Zodiac Netsuke if you visit our website, chesterbeatty.ie. And there are a small number of Edmund's books available in our shop this evening, which I thought some of you might want to take advantage of. So thank you once again. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
May I just thank our wonderful signer, because thank you so much.